it's an enormous collection of emails, email attachments, and other records that came primarily from U.S. public universities that document projects that were supported by DARPA, the U.S. military research agency, as well as the Gates Foundation and other funders to deploy gene drives on islands in various parts of the world. And what the gene drives show is the sort of nexus of relationships between these groups and the reality behind their sort of PR push to get gene drives approved at the Biodiversity Convention. Fortunately, when the gene drive files came out, I think that the Secretariat at the Biodiversity Convention realized that they had a problem because they could read the files themselves and see that that the Gates-funded political consultants were literally even writing the independent interventions of scientists for them. So that did result in the development of a conflict of interest policy, or really what it is a declaration of interest type policy, because it's okay for everybody to come to the table with their different priorities and their different biases, but when they're hidden, as it was with the case that was what was uncovered by the gene drive files, that's really problematic, because if you have people representing themselves as being independent, uninfluenced scientists who in fact are being influenced and even are having words put in their mouths by the political consultants, that's really troublesome for the integrity of the process. There are two important aspects to this. I think that first, you need to have greater involvement of genuinely independent scientists. And it's not strictly limited to, say, the biologists that are interested in creating or deploying gene drives, but everyone that's in related fields that has expertise in biodiversity that might be impacted by them. So first of all, you need to have a genuinely representative and genuinely independent and high integrity sort of scientific input into this, not folks that have things at stake. They can have their say, but it needs to be balanced with people that don't have any skin in the game, who are going to offer their genuine opinion as scientists. And I think that even more importantly than that, you need to have the broadest swath of people that are potentially impacted by this at the table, because you are dealing with organisms that, by design or by accident, have the potential to spread globally, or really into any environment where the organism is capable of surviving, and that means that the initial release may occur in one part of the world, but it may wind up in another, and it may have very deleterious effects for biodiversity in another, and that may be on the lands of indigenous people. It will be potentially in a different country than where it was released. So really recognizing and coming to terms with the potentially global impacts of these organisms is necessary, because if you have the consent of the people in the immediate zone where it's released, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot if you have no means by which to control the organism from spreading much more widely and impacting much more people. So the proper process kind of looks like a rainbow, right? You got everybody at the table, because as a sort of technological reality, you can't say that these organisms are going to stay in one place and it's only a discrete subset of people whose consent and participation you need. That's simply just an inaccurate representation of what these things are. You get a picture of what is the reality, not the version of reality that governments want to present. So you can ground proof or disprove assertions by government officials who would include professors at public universities based upon what their correspondence and what their records actually say, as opposed to what the public relations representative or what other public statements by the university are, which may have been spun to serve certain ends. So, this idea that you can actually get the documents that demonstrate what the actual truth is about how issues are being treated and how decisions are made and what those decisions are, I think is really important because, to be quite honest, there are many officials in many agencies that will spin reality beyond the truth and or downplay risks in public statements, and then you might discover in FOIA that they actually are cognizant of it and they take it seriously in private, but they just don't want to admit it. So that sort of thing happens all the time, and it's also very useful. Can be very useful in uncovering hidden relationships. So, for example, in the gene drive files, the role of the Gates Foundation and the role of Emerging Ag, the Canadian political consultants, and the role of the different U.S. universities and NGOs, those relationships were not publicly acknowledged in large part, but they were demonstrated by the actual records that came back from the FOIA requests. What can be said with certainty is that DARPA has no interest and has no mission, has no mandate to involve itself in biodiversity conservation projects. And nobody seriously believes that DARPA would fund these gene drive projects out of an interest in preserving bird biodiversity on islands. Okay, DARPA's mission is to United States defense. And its interest in gene drives relates to U.S. biological defense priorities. And more specifically, I think that it is understood by DARPA and by others in militaries and in defense agencies that gene drives probably have a military application if somebody were to decide to do so. You can imagine that eradicating or altering important species and within a country could have devastating economic impact or beyond that health impact. And therefore DARPA decided that it wants to get to the bottom of what can be done with gene drives. And the conservationists turned out to be a convenient vehicle by which the U.S. Army could explore the potential of gene drives. And it should be said that that's not because the United States Army wants to use gene drives as a weapon, but the reason why is that the United States military feels as if it must have a superior knowledge and ability to react to biotechnology. But the concern from people that are familiar with arms control issues and with what's called dual-use research around biotechnology is that by funding these sorts of projects, the U.S. military will, in effect, encourage other countries around the world to also have their militaries or their defense establishment fund research into gene drives. And because of mutual suspicion between countries, this can wind up badly. This was maybe the most immediately important and impactful aspect of the gene drive files was the realization that the Gates Foundation had secretly funded Canadian political consultants to go out and to round up scientists and put words in their mouth in what were supposed to be independent scientific consultations conducted by the Biodiversity Convention. So the reality that was exposed by the emails and other records that came back in those Freedom of Information requests was that the Gates Foundation was paying a political group to write up daily or nearly daily reports on the CBD's activity, suggest to these scientists how they should reply, and in at least one case even directly write the intervention of scientists who were supposed to be participating in the processes as independent experts, as experts who were offering an educated, independent opinion that had not been influenced by proponents or opponents of the technology. But it turns out that many of the experts that were participating in the CBD process, in fact, were being guided and pushed and prodded by this Gates project to try to ram approval through for the deployment of gene drives. What's absolutely clear is that either by deliberate design or by inadequate means of control, which I would argue are present in far more circumstances than we generally acknowledge, that gene drive organisms have the capability to spread globally, or in the case of any individual organism, across all or many of the ecosystems in which it's capable of surviving. So when you think about, well, what is the societal buy-in, what is the proper process by which any such organism should be released, you're not talking about obtaining the approval of the people or a government that has one small place, because it's quite possible that the organism spreads from there and goes elsewhere. And so the actual impacted populations may be much greater and much further afield than would be contemplated by a process that's purely focused on an individual release in its locale. It wouldn't be the first time that a new and not thoroughly vetted and even ultimately harmful technology was deployed, and the losers were those with fewer resources and those without a voice in the process, right? So, if you're talking about a gene drive organism that could affect the agricultural conditions in farming communities, or that could affect the biodiversity that indigenous people rely upon, you're having a direct impact on them. And if they're not at the table, and if they're not able to participate in the process of reviewing this technology or saying no to it, that's something that I find ethically intolerable. First, I would always argue that getting the truth out in the form of original documentation is really important to holding them accountable. Because if you are able to, let's say, work from primary sources in the sense of obtaining the emails and the communications between the companies and the funders and the universities that are participants in the development of the technology, then their reality is there, and that promotes accountability, because those players are no longer able to rely on spin doctors to characterize what they're doing. Instead, the whole world can look at what their internal records actually say, which is what happened with the gene drives. The other part of it is ensuring the integrity of processes to evaluate these technologies at the international level. And the gene drives there again showed a threat to the integrity of that process, which was Gates money coming in and trying to co-opt scientists into saying what they wanted. So the integrity of the processes, access to primary documentation, and obviously wide participation and empowered participation in the sense that you don't just you don't just go to a disempowered group, small farmers or indigenous people, and purport to ask their opinion about something, but rather you involve them in the process for real.